Excalibur. Caliburn is the legendary sword of King Arthur, sometimes attributed with magical powers or associated with the rightful sovereignty of Great Britain. Sometimes Excalibur and the sword in the stone are said to be the same weapon, but in most versions they are considered separate. The sword was associated with the Arthurian legend very early. In Welsh, the sword is called Caledvulc'h. In Cornish, the sword is called Calesvol. In Breton, the sword is called Caledvoulc'h. In Latin, the sword is called Caliburnus. Forms and etymologies. The name Excalibur ultimately comes from the ancestor of Welsh Caledfwlch, which is a compound of Cald, hard, and Vulc, breach, cleft. Caledfwlch appears in several early Welsh works, including the poem Prewnwfn and the prose tale Culch and Olwen, a work associated with the Mabinogion and written perhaps around 1100. The name was later used in Welsh adaptations of foreign material such as the ruts, which were based on Geoffrey of Monmouth. It is often considered to be related to the phonetically similar Caledvoulc'h, a sword borne by several figures from Irish mythology, although a borrowing of Caledvulc'h from Irish Caledvoulc'h has been considered unlikely by Rachel Bromwich and E. Simon Evans. They suggest instead that both names may have similarly arisen at a very early date as generic names for a sword. This sword then became exclusively the property of Arthur in the British tradition. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Historia Regum Britanniae, Latinized the name of Arthur's sword as Caliburnus and states that it was forged in the Isle of Avalon. Most Celticists consider Geoffrey's Caliburnus to be derivative of a lost Old Welsh text in which Bulk had not yet been lenited to FWLCH. In Old French sources this then became Excalibur, Excalibur, and finally the familiar Excalibur. Geoffrey Gaimard, in his Old French L'Histoire des Angles, mentions Arthur and his sword. This Constantine was the nephew of Arthur, who had the sword Caliburn. Ingwes' Roman de Brute, an Old French translation and versification of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. The sword is called Calibrum, Caliburch, Caliburn, and Caliburn. In Creation de Troyes' late 12th century Old French Perceval, Gawain carries the sword Excalibur, and it is stated, for at his belt hung Excalibur, the finest sword that there was, which sliced through iron as through wood. This statement was probably picked up by the author of the Histoire Merlin, or Vulgate Merlin, where the author asserts that Excalibur is a Hebrew name which means in French, cuts iron, steel, and wood. It is from this fanciful etymological musing that Thomas Malory got the notion that Excalibur meant cut steel, Excalibur, and the sword in the stone. In Arthurian romance, a number of explanations are given for Arthur's possession of Excalibur. In Robert de Boron's Merlin, Arthur obtained the British throne by pulling a sword from a stone. In this account, the act could not be performed except by the true king, meaning the divinely appointed king, a true heir of Uther Pendragon. This sword is thought by many to be the famous Excalibur, and its identity is made explicit in the later prose Merlin, part of the Lancelot Grail cycle. This version also appears in the 1938 Arthurian novel The Sword in the Stone by British author T. H. White, and the Disney adaptation. They both quote the line from Thomas Malory in the 15th century, "Whoso pulleth at this sword of the stone and anvil, is rightwise king born of all England." The challenge of drawing a sword from a stone also appears in the Arthurian legends of Galahad, whose achievement of the task indicates that he is destined to find the Holy Grail. However, in what is called the post-Vulgate cycle, Excalibur was given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake sometime after he began to reign. She calls the sword Excalibur, that is as to say, as cut steel. Quote, in the Vulgate Mortata, Arthur orders Griflet to throw the sword into the enchanted lake. After 2 failed attempts, he finally complies with the wounded king's request and a hand emerges from the lake to catch it, a tale which becomes attached to Bedivere instead in Malory and the English tradition. Malory records both versions of the legend in his La Morte d'Arthur, naming both swords as Excalibur. History. In Welsh legend, Arthur's sword is known as Caledfwlch. In Culchen Olwen, it is one of Arthur's most valuable possessions and is used by Arthur's warrior Lenliaug the Irishman to kill the Irish king Dyfnech while stealing his magical cauldron. Irish mythology mentions a weapon Kaledvoulc'h, the sword of Fergus MacRoich. Caledvoulc'h was also known for its incredible power and was carried by some of Ireland's greatest heroes. The name, which can also mean hard cleft in Irish, appears in the plural Caledvoulc'h as a generic term for great swords in Togal Troy. The 10th century Irish translation of the classical tale, though not named as Caledfwlch, Arthur's sword is described vividly in the Dream of Rhonabwy, one of the tales associated with the Mabinogion. Then they heard Cadwr Earl of Cornwall being summoned, and saw him rise with Arthur's sword in his hand, with a design of 2 chimeras on the golden hilt. When the sword was unsheathed, what was seen from the mouths of the 2 chimeras was like 2 flames of fire, so dreadful that it was not easy for anyone to look at that. The host settled and the commotion subsided, and the earl returned to his tent. In the late 15th, early 16th century Middle Cornish play Bunan's K. Arthur's sword is called Calesvol, which is etymologically an exact Middle Cornish cognate of the Welsh Caledfwlch. It is unclear if the name was borrowed from the Welsh, or represents an early, pan-Brittonic traditional name for Arthur's sword. Geoffrey's Historia is the first non-Welsh source to speak of the sword. Geoffrey says the sword was forged in Avalon and Latinizes the name Caledfwlch as Caliburnus, when his influential pseudo-history made it to continental Europe. Writers altered the name further until it finally took on the popular form Excalibur. The legend was expanded upon in the Vulgate cycle, also known as the Lancelot Grail cycle, and in the post-Vulgate cycle which emerged in its way. Both included the work known as the Prose Merlin, but the post-Vulgate authors left out the Merlin continuation from the earlier cycle, choosing to add an original account of Arthur's early days, including a new origin for Excalibur. In several early French works, such as Création de Troyes Perceval, the story of the Grail, and the Vulgate Lancelot proper section, Excalibur is used by Gawain, Arthur's nephew and one of his best knights. This is in contrast to later versions, where Excalibur belongs solely to the king. Attributes. In many versions, Excalibur's blade was engraved with phrases on opposite sides: "Take me up" and "Cast me away." In addition, when Excalibur was first drawn, in the first battle testing Arthur's sovereignty, its blade blinded his enemies. Thomas Malory writes, "Then he drew his sword Excalibur, but it was so bright in his enemy's eye that it gave light like 30 torches." Excalibur's scabbard was said to have powers of its own. Loss of blood from injuries, for example, would not kill the bearer. In some tellings, wounds received by one wearing the scabbard did not bleed at all. The scabbard is stolen by Morgan Le Fay in revenge for the death of her beloved at Cullen and thrown into a lake, never to be found again. 19th century poet Alfred Lord Tennyson described the sword in full romantic detail in his poem Morte d'Arthur, later rewritten written as the passing of Arthur, one of the idylls of the king, that drew he forth the brand Excalibur, and o'er him, drawing it, the winter moon, brightening the skirts of a long cloud, ran forth and sparkled keen with frost against the hilt. For all the haft twinkled with diamond sparks, myriads of topaz lights, and jacinth work of subtlest jewelry. Arthur's other weapons. Excalibur is by no means the only weapon associated with Arthur, nor the only sword. Welsh tradition also knew of a dagger named Carnwenan and a spear named Rhwng o Myniad that belonged to him. Carnwenan first appears in Culture Olwen, where it was used by Arthur to slice the Black Witch in half. Rhwng o Myniad is also first mentioned in Culture, although only in passing. It appears as simply Ron in Geoffrey's Historia. In the alliterative Morte Arthur, a Middle English poem, there is mention of clarent, a sword of peace meant for knighting in ceremonies as opposed to battle, which was stolen and then used to kill Arthur by Mordred. The prose Lancelot of the Vulgate cycle mentions a sword called Siri, which belonged to the king but was used by Lancelot in one battle. Similar weapons. There are other similar weapons described in other mythologies, in particular, Caledfwlch, which is an Irish term meaning sword of light or shining sword, which appears in a number of orally transmitted Irish folk tales.